The corrupt cop laughed in open court. Not a nervous chuckle, not a diplomatic cough into his fist. A real, full-throated laugh, the kind that fills a high-ceilinged room and dares every person in it to say something about it. Officer Bryce Kemp leaned back in his chair at the defense table, looked directly at Calvin and me, and said loud enough for the front rows of the gallery to hear clearly, "These boys think they're heroes." A few people in the back actually snickered. The judge shuffled papers and said nothing, and I sat there, hands flat on the oak table, spine straight, jaw locked, watching the man who had spent years trying to bury us finally believe he had won. He didn't notice the side door opening. He didn't see who walked in. But I did, and the laugh died on his face before he even understood why. But to understand what happened in that courtroom, you need to understand what led us there. Because none of it started with uniforms or badges or gavels. It started with a barbecue. Calvin Reed and I had served together for years. Multiple deployments. One classified operation I still can't discuss without signing several forms in triplicate. We had pulled each other out of firefights, out of flooded drainage channels, out of situations that don't have clean names. When we finally mustered out within months of each other, we both ended up in the same place, a mid-sized town on the Virginia coast called Harker's Point, the kind of place where the streets are clean and the marina smells like salt and diesel, and someone always has a grill going on a Saturday afternoon. Calvin had family there, an aunt and 2 cousins who'd been asking him to come home for years. I followed because, honestly, I didn't have a better plan. And I'd learned a long time ago that when Calvin Reed suggested something, it was worth listening to. The barbecue was at his Aunt Gloria's house, a wide, pale yellow craftsman 2 blocks from the water, with a yard full of mismatched lawn chairs and a folding table that groaned under the weight of food. Gloria was a small woman with enormous hands and a laugh you could hear from the street. And she had clearly told every person she knew that her nephew was coming home. There were many people in that yard by mid-afternoon. Calvin stood at the grill with an apron that said, "World's Okayest Chef," and flipped ribs with the kind of focused calm he brought to everything. And I sat in a canvas chair with a cold beer and felt for the first time in a long time like I might actually be okay. "You look like a man who just remembered what a weekend is," Calvin said, not looking up from the grill. "I look like a man who hasn't sat still in years," I said. "Same thing." He glanced over at me, a half-smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. "You good getting there?" I said honestly. He nodded, satisfied with that, and turned back to the ribs. That was one of the things I'd always respected about Calvin. He never pushed. He asked once, got a real answer, and let that be enough. Gloria came out through the back screen door carrying a tray of corn, and she stopped behind my chair and put one of those big hands on my shoulder for just a second without saying anything. And somehow that landed harder than any speech would have. I had to look away at the water for a moment and collect myself. The sun was doing that late afternoon thing where everything turns gold and soft. And somewhere down the block, someone had music going. Something old. Something Motown. And the whole afternoon had this particular quality of grace that I hadn't felt since before the deployments. I should have known. The way you always know in hindsight, that things that feel exactly that good have a cost somewhere down the line. The first time I saw Officer Bryce Kemp was weeks after that barbecue. Calvin and I had just come out of a hardware store. We'd been helping Gloria fix a rotten section of her back fence, and Kemp was leaning against a cruiser in the parking lot talking to another officer. He was a big man, gone soft around the middle, with a salt and pepper crew cut, and small pale eyes that moved over you the way a scanner moves over a document. He looked at us as we came out. Nothing happened. We loaded the lumber into Calvin's truck and drove away. And I didn't think about it again, but I noticed something. It was a small thing, the kind you file away without realizing you're filing it. As we pulled out of the lot, Kemp said something to the other officer, and the other officer laughed, and both of them watched us go. I had been trained to notice things. I noticed that. The second time was about a week later. Calvin and I were running in the early morning, a habit from service that neither of us had broken, along a trail that followed the edge of the marina. It was early, pale gray light. Seagulls working the water. A cruiser slowed as it passed us. Kemp. He didn't stop, didn't say anything, just slowed. Watched us for some time, then drove on. Calvin hadn't seemed to notice, or if he had, he wasn't saying. "You know that cop?" I asked, watching the cruiser's taillights disappear around the bend. "Which cop?" "Kemp, the one with the crew cut. He was in the hardware store parking lot last week." Calvin thought about it vaguely. "Gloria mentioned something about him once, didn't say what." He glanced over at me. "Why? No reason," I said. But the thing that had been filed away opened a drawer and sat down and didn't leave. The third time changed everything. It was a Friday night in September, some weeks after the barbecue. Calvin and I had gone to a place called the Blue Anchor, a low-key seafood spot 2 streets back from the water with good crab cakes and terrible lighting. We were the last customers, and we lingered over coffee the way you do when you don't have anywhere to be, talking about whether Calvin was going to take the job offer from a private security firm out of Norfolk, and what I was going to do about my apartment lease running out soon. Normal conversation, the kind that costs you nothing and gives you everything. We walked out late. The street was quiet, just the distant sound of music from a bar 2 blocks over and the smell of the ocean. We'd reached Calvin's truck when headlights swung in from the far end of the street. 2 sets, 2 cruisers, and they pulled up slowly and boxed us in nose to nose with the truck. Kemp got out of the first car. 2 officers I didn't recognize got out of the second. They moved in a spread that was practiced, deliberate, and entirely unnecessary for 2 men standing next to a parked vehicle on an empty street. I kept my hands visible and my voice even. Years of discipline doesn't just turn off because the threat is wearing a badge instead of a turban. "Evening," Kemp said. He had his thumbs hooked in his belt and something in his tone. Not loud, not aggressive exactly, but loose, almost amused. The way a man sounds when he is very comfortable with the power he holds and doesn't feel the need to disguise that comfort. "Evening, officer," I said. He was looking at Calvin, not at me. And something about the way he looked at Calvin made the back of my neck tighten the way it used to tighten in certain streets in Kandahar. "Just dinner," Calvin said. He was the same as always, measured, giving nothing away. "The Blue Anchor." "Uh-huh." Kemp rocked back on his heels, unhurried. "You boys live around here?" That word, boys. I felt it land the way a flat stone lands in still water. Not a splash, just a ripple that spreads outward and doesn't stop. I watched Calvin absorb it with no visible reaction, and I kept my own face neutral because I knew with the instinct that years of high-stakes operations had built into my bones that this was a moment where any reaction at all would be used against us. "I live here," Calvin said. "He's 2 streets over on Mercantile." "Got it." Kemp turned and looked at the truck slowly, as if he had all the time in the world, which he did. "Whose vehicle is this?" "Mine," Calvin said. "Registration on you? In the glove box. Why don't you get that for me?" Calvin moved slowly, deliberately, narrating every action. "I'm opening the door. I'm reaching into the glove box." The way you do when you understand that your body is being read by someone looking for a justification. He retrieved the registration and his license and handed them to Kemp. Kemp took his time. He held the documents at arm's length, tilted them toward the streetlight, handed them to one of the other officers without looking, and then stood there for a long moment, saying nothing. The silence was intentional. I knew that too. He was making us wait because he could, and because he wanted us to feel that he could, and because there was no polite way to refuse the waiting. "You served," Kemp finally said, looking at me. "Yes, sir." "Where at?" "Army." Something moved across his face. Not quite a smirk, not quite contempt. Something that lived in between those two things. "Special operations." "Yes, sir." He made a small sound, just an exhale through the nose. Then he said conversationally, as if it were a perfectly normal thing to say to two men on a quiet street late at night, "Funny thing about heroes, they're everywhere these days." I said nothing. Calvin said nothing. Kemp held the moment for another stretch, then handed back the documents and walked back to his car without hurry. No ticket, no citation, no explanation. The two cruisers pulled away. The street was quiet again. I stood there with the cool night air on my face and the golden feeling from the barbecue, from the whole peaceful period, curdling into something colder and harder that I didn't have a name for yet. But I could feel the shape of it. I knew what it was made of. "Calvin," I said. "Yeah." "What did Gloria say about him?" "A beat. Then she said he's been in Harker's Point for years, that he owns a piece of the pawn shop on Clement Street, that he sits on the town liquor board, and that every black family in this zip code knows to stay out of his way." I stood there and let that settle. "You should have told me. I thought we were having a peaceful stretch," Calvin said quietly. He wasn't wrong, but the peaceful stretch was over. Over the next weeks, it became a pattern. Not every night, not even every week, but consistent enough and irregular enough that it couldn't be dismissed as coincidence. A cruiser behind us on the way home from the gym. A stop at a light where Kemp rolled down his window, looked at us for a long moment, and drove on without speaking. Then came the thing that changed my understanding of what we were dealing with. Gloria's neighbor, a retired school teacher named Mrs. Ellison, knocked on Gloria's door one morning, holding a cup of tea that had gone cold in her hand, her face carrying that particular expression of someone reporting something frightening in measured language because they don't want to give it more power. "He asked very specific questions," she said at the kitchen table. "Whether Calvin had a history of trouble, whether he'd brought anyone with him." She looked at Gloria steadily. "I told him nothing. I want you to know that." Gloria sat with her hands folded on the table and said nothing for a long moment. Then she looked at me with an expression I had seen before. Not fear exactly, but the look of someone who has been managing a threat for a very long time and has just learned that the threat has taken a new interest. "He did this to the Harmon family some years ago," she said. Their son came back from the army and bought the garage on Route 9. Kemp ran him out inside of some time. I asked what happened. Gloria looked at her hands. Noise complaints, zoning violations, 2 arrests for things that didn't stick, 1 that did, just barely. Something cold and deliberate settled in my chest. Not panic. I'd learned to be suspicious of panic a long time ago. Something more like the particular stillness that comes when you understand that what you're facing is real, systematic, and patient. The kind of opposition that doesn't lose its temper because it doesn't need to. "We need an attorney," I said. "We haven't done anything," Calvin said. He was leaning in the kitchen doorway with his arms crossed, looking at the floor. "That," I said carefully, "is not actually the relevant factor here, and we both knew it. We found the attorney through a friend of Gloria's, a woman named Nia Okoro, who ran a small practice in Norfolk and had a reputation for taking cases that most firms found inconvenient. She was in her early 50s, meticulous, and had the kind of absolute stillness about her that suggested she had heard everything at least twice and had long since stopped being surprised by any of it. Her office smelled like good coffee and printer ink, and the particular orderly quiet of someone who manages chaos professionally. We laid out everything: dates, times, descriptions, Mrs. Ellison's account, the names, the pattern. Nia listened without interrupting. When we finished, she was quiet for a moment, her pen resting still between her fingers. "Is this the extent of it?" she asked. "So far," Calvin said. "Then we document," she said. "Everything. Every stop, every contact, every interaction, timestamps, photographs when possible, written accounts the same day while details are fresh. We build a record." She set down the pen and looked at us without flinching. "He will escalate. They always do when they realize documentation has started. When that happens, I need you to be very careful." "How careful?" I asked. "Perfect," she said. "I need you to be perfect." I nodded. I understood what she meant. I had spent years training to perform under pressure. I knew how to be perfect. I just hadn't expected to need that skill while walking to my own front door. What I didn't know, what neither of us knew yet, was that Kemp wasn't just running a harassment campaign out of personal hostility. That was the first layer of what we were looking at. The second layer was underneath it, and it was considerably darker, and it involved a name that would not appear until a document surfaced weeks later in a way that made my hands stop working for a full moment. The document surfaced on a morning, and the way it came to us was so ordinary that I almost missed what I was holding. Calvin had gone to the county recorder's office to pull a zoning map Gloria needed for something related to her fence permit. One of those bureaucratic errands that feel like sandpaper on your patience and mean absolutely nothing. The clerk, a young woman with reading glasses pushed up into her hair, had printed the wrong file by mistake and slid it across the counter with the map before noticing her error. She reached back to take it, and Calvin, out of habit or instinct or simple politeness, had already picked it up and glanced at it. He brought it home without fully understanding what he'd seen, and he set it on the kitchen table in front of me without saying anything. Just laid it flat and stepped back. I looked at it for a long moment before my hands understood what my eyes were reading. It was a property transfer record. The address was a warehouse on the eastern edge of Harker's Point, a property I had driven past and thought nothing of. The seller was a shell company registered in Delaware. The beneficial owner of that shell company, buried layers down in an attachment the clerk had apparently printed by accident alongside the main record, was listed as a trust. The trustee's name was Bryce A. Kemp. I put the paper down on the table. I put my palms flat on the table next to it. I looked at the address on the record again carefully, as if looking harder might change what it said. The warehouse on the eastern edge of Harker's Point, I now recalled, was near the garage on Route 9 that had belonged to the Harmon family's son. The one Kemp had systematically destroyed with noise complaints and zoning violations and arrests that barely stuck. The garage that had eventually sold at a distressed price when the Harmon family ran out of the will and the money to keep fighting. I picked up the paper again. My hands were steady. My chest was doing something different from steady, but my hands were steady. "Nia needs to see this today," I said. Calvin was leaning in the doorway. He nodded once slowly with the expression of a man who had suspected the water was deep and has just found out exactly how deep. Nia Okoro's reaction told me everything I needed to know about how serious this was, because Nia Okoro almost never reacted visibly to anything. She took the document, read it twice, set it down, and then sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. When she looked back at us, something in her expression had sharpened to a fine, clean edge. "He's been running a displacement operation," she said quietly. "The harassment isn't incidental. It's the method. He drives families out. Properties lose value or get sold under pressure, and the trust acquires them. She tapped the document with one finger. The Harmon Garage. What else do you know about properties near where you've been stopped or observed? We spent the next hours at her conference table with a county map and a laptop. By the time we were done, we had identified multiple properties acquired by Kemp's Trust over the years. All of them within a close radius of families Nia was now going to contact. All of them purchased below market value within months of documented harassment complaints that had gone nowhere. It was not coincidence. It was a business model. I need to make some calls, Nia said. She was already writing. Don't discuss this with anyone. Don't change your behavior. Don't let him know you found anything. Keep documenting. She looked up at us over the rim of her glasses. And I need to ask you something directly. Is there anyone you served with who might have reason to know about your service records? Anyone in a position of institutional authority who respects what you did? Calvin and I looked at each other. The same name occurred to us at the same time. I could see it happen, the recognition moving across Calvin's face exactly as it moved across mine. Rear Admiral Raymond Greer had commanded our task force for the last years of our service. He was in his 60s, ramrod straight, and possessed of a particular moral clarity that had nothing theatrical about it. He was simply a man who had decided early in his life what was right and wrong, and had spent decades acting accordingly without drama or announcement. He had shaken both our hands at our separation ceremonies. He had written Calvin's recommendation letter for the security firm in Norfolk. He had my personal number in his contacts because I had helped his daughter navigate a college application process some time ago, and he had never formally ended the favor exchange. I hadn't spoken to him in some time, but I knew that if I called him and explained what was happening, he would listen, and then he would act in whatever way was available to him, because that was what Raymond Greer did. I made the call from the parking lot of Nia's building while Calvin waited inside. It rang twice. Brooks, Greer said, because he answered his phone that way. Your name. No preamble. Admiral, I said. I need some time. He gave me more. When I finished, there was a brief silence on the line. The kind that means someone is thinking, not that they're gone. Send me what you have, he said. All of it, not summaries, the documents themselves. Yes, sir. Another pause. Are you and Calvin safe right now? Yes, sir. Keep it that way, he said. I'm going to make some calls of my own. I stood in the parking lot for a moment after the call ended, looking at the pale October sky over the rooftops of Norfolk. The cold air tasted clean. For the first time since that Friday night at the Blue Anchor, I felt the specific sensation of not being alone in something. The weight redistributed, the problem still real, but suddenly shared. I went back inside and told Calvin. He exhaled slowly through his nose, looked at the floor, and said, "Okay?" Just that, but okay, from Calvin Reed meant something. It meant we were going to be fine. Weeks later, Kemp arrested us. It was manufactured from the first second. We were parked outside Gloria's house, engine off, and Kemp pulled up with 2 cars and claimed a neighbor had reported suspicious activity. He cited a resisted charge against Calvin that was so transparently false that even one of the officers with him looked briefly uncertain. We were processed, released within hours on our own recognizance, and Nia was on the phone before we'd walked 2 blocks from the station. But the arrest had a purpose, and the purpose became clear days later when we learned that Kemp had filed a civil complaint alleging that Calvin and I had been operating an unlicensed security business and that this business was a front for intimidation of local residents. It was the same playbook he'd run on the Harmon family. It was designed to create a paper record that would justify further actions, further harassment, and ultimately make us radioactive enough that any complaint we filed would be read against a background of official suspicion. The hearing was set for some weeks later. Nia walked into it with a folder thick and the kind of focused expression I'd only previously seen on people about to enter a very dangerous room. The courtroom was not large. Wood paneling, fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly if you listened, a gallery that held many people. Gloria was there with Mrs. Ellison. Nia had quietly notified several journalists who were seated in the gallery with notebooks. Kemp sat at the defense table in his dress uniform, composed and comfortable, flanked by the city attorney's representative and his own personal counsel. He hadn't expected much opposition. That was clear in the set of his shoulders, loose, easy. The posture of a man who has done this before and knows how it ends. Nia entered our evidence in 3 phases. The property records came first. Kemp's trust, the shell company structure, the acquisitions. The timeline of each purchase mapped against documented harassment complaints filed by the previous owners. The city attorney's representative kept his face very still. But I watched him, and I knew what very still meant. The second phase was the testimonials. Mrs. Ellison, 2 members of the Harmon family who had driven from out of town, and a woman named Louise Garrett, whose family had lost a beauty supply shop on Clement Street some years ago, in circumstances that were now in this context recognizable. Kemp's attorney objected to each piece of testimony. The judge, a compact woman with reading glasses on a beaded chain, overruled several times and sustained once on a narrow technical point that Nia had already anticipated and worked around. Then Kemp leaned back in his chair during a brief recess and said it, not to us directly, to his attorney, but in a voice calibrated for the rows immediately behind him. The voice of a man who wants an audience but wants deniability about wanting one. These boys think they're heroes. A small laugh, a few uncomfortable smirks from people who didn't know how to respond to a man with a badge, being casually contemptible. I kept my hands flat on the table. Calvin was looking at a fixed point somewhere above the bench. Nia next to me wrote something on her legal pad, tore it off, and slid it to me without looking up. It said, "Don't react. Watch the door." I'd been watching the door for some time already because I had gotten a text minutes ago with 3 words, "In the building." The side door opened quietly. Admiral Raymond Greer walked in. He was in full dress uniform, every decoration, every ribbon, every piece of brass exactly where it was supposed to be. And he moved the way he always moved, without hurry, without theater, with the complete authority of a man who has never once in his adult life needed to announce himself. He took a seat in the front row of the gallery, folded his hands in his lap, and looked at Kemp with the steady, pleasant attention of someone watching a documentary that is about to reach its conclusion. Kemp saw him. I know he saw him because the loose set of his shoulders changed. It was subtle, a half-inch shift, a minor tightening. But I'd been trained to read bodies the way other people read text, and I read it clearly. He didn't know what it meant yet. He would. Greer had not come alone. Seated rows back were 2 people Nia had identified to me the previous day. A representative from the State Attorney General's office who had been quietly investigating municipal corruption in coastal counties for some time, and had been very interested when Nia shared what we'd found, and a federal housing attorney who had been looking at a pattern of racially targeted property displacement in the same region for even longer. They were not there to testify. They were there to observe and to be seen observing, which accomplished something different and more immediate than testimony. It sent a message about the scale of the attention that had quietly assembled itself around Bryce Kemp's comfortable little operation. Nia stood for her closing argument and laid it out with the clean efficiency of someone who has organized every fact into its exact right place and needs no rhetorical flourishes because the facts themselves are already devastating. The pattern of acquisition, the timing, the method, the families, the false arrest, the complaint constructed on fabrications. She spoke for some time without notes and without raising her voice, and when she finished, the courtroom had a particular quality of silence, not awkward, not uncertain, but the silence of people who have just watched something be dismantled completely and are waiting for someone to acknowledge it. Kemp's attorney tried. He was a professional, and he gave it everything a professional could give it. But Naya had closed every exit, and his arguments fell into the spaces between the evidence with small flat sounds that meant nothing. The judge had the expression of a woman who has seen enough and is now simply completing a process that has already reached its conclusion. When the judge turned to Kemp and began to outline her findings, his attorney put a hand on Kemp's arm. The gesture of a man trying to keep something from tipping over. It didn't help. The civil complaint against Calvin and me was dismissed with prejudice. The judge referred the property acquisition records to the State Attorney General's office, a referral the AG representative in the gallery received with a brief nod and made a formal recommendation that the City Council review Kemp's fitness to serve. She said the word systematic once, and then discriminatory once, and then she said in a voice that carried no drama whatsoever, "Officer Kemp, I strongly suggest you speak with your personal attorney before leaving this building." Kemp sat very still. His jaw was a locked line. The loose ease of some time ago was gone, and what was underneath it was smaller and tighter and older-looking than I had expected. I had expected anger. What I saw instead was something I recognized from the faces of men I had watched realize that a situation they believed they controlled had moved beyond their reach while they weren't paying attention. While we were there, Sandra gathered her papers with quiet efficiency. I stood, and Calvin stood, and Admiral Raymond Greer rose from the front row of the gallery and walked toward us with both hands extended. He gripped my hand first, then Calvin's, and held each for a moment longer than a handshake requires. "Good work," he said. That was all. He didn't need more. Behind us, I heard Kemp's attorney speaking in a low, urgent voice. I didn't look back. The consequences moved quickly after that, the way consequences do when the machinery that was blocking them has been removed. The state AG's investigation, which had been stalled for lack of a clear documentary anchor, opened into full operation within weeks. By some time later, multiple properties acquired through the trust were under legal review for fraudulent displacement. By the following period, Kemp had resigned from the department in lieu of termination proceedings. The pawnshop partnership, once examined, revealed additional financial irregularities that became their own separate thread of investigation. The City Liquor Board removed him. His attorney gave a statement describing his client as eager to cooperate, which is what attorneys say when their clients have run out of other options. The Harmon family filed a civil suit later. Louise Garrett's family joined it soon after. Nia told me the settlement negotiations opened at a number she described as serious, which from Nia meant considerable. Months after the courtroom, I drove to Gloria's house on a Saturday afternoon. It was warm again, the kind of day that smells like the start of something, and Calvin was in the backyard with his aunt, repairing the section of fence we'd never quite finished. I sat in the canvas chair I'd been sitting in that first afternoon and drank coffee and watched them work. And after a while, Calvin looked over at me across the yard. "You good?" he asked. Same as before. "Yeah," I said. And this time, it wasn't the honest way the first answer had been honest. Not getting there. Not almost. It was just clean and complete and true. "Yeah, I'm good." Gloria straightened up from the fence post and looked at me with those big hands on her hips and a small smile that meant she understood exactly what was underneath those two words. The coffee was warm. The sky was clear. The fence was almost done. I thought about Kemp, about the moment he had said that word on the empty Friday night street, leaning on his authority the way a man leans on a door he thinks is bolted from his side. I thought about what it cost him to find out it wasn't, and then I let the thought go. The way you let a stone drop from your hand into deep water, not with drama, not even with satisfaction, just the clean release of something that has been carried long enough. The Motown song from down the block was something different that day, newer, brighter. Calvin's cousin came out through the back door with a plate of food and started arguing cheerfully with her mother about something that had nothing to do with any of this. And Gloria laughed, that big, unmissable laugh. And the afternoon light was warm on the back of my hands.